Tonight on Nation to Nation, our final political panel of the season. The opposition says the federal government is failing Indigenous people.
Whether it's unable to explain what a nation-to-nation is, a missing and murdered inquiry going off the track, the file is a mess.
Pipelines and dams are just a few of the things Green Party leader Elizabeth May is here to discuss.
But it's clear that the bogus process upon which Kinder Morgan was subjected to a sham of a review does not have any credibility.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamourand, and welcome to Nation to Nation. It's our final political panel of the season. Time to reflect on the federal government's handling of Indigenous affairs, something Minister Carolyn Bennett gave the thumbs up to in the House of Commons this week.
We are proud to look forward to this new relationship based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation and partnership, and I am proud to stand in this House with our record.
Join me are panelists Liberal MP Don Rusnick and Conservative MP Cathy McLeod. And for our last panel of the season, I welcome for the first time NDP MP Sheila Malcolmson. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks.
Now, off the bat, I'm going to start with you, Ms. McLeod. On Monday, you stood up in the House and said the Indigenous file is a big mess. What's the biggest mess to date?
Well, certainly a cornerstone of their commitments, the Liberal government's commitments, was the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry. And certainly between the letter that was sent to the commissioners and the report card from Native Women's Association, there's been a lot of concerns that have been brewing for a lot of months now, and I think they've just come to a head. And we've got to get a handle on this file. You know, certainly I'll recognize that as Conservatives, we were reluctant to move ahead with an inquiry because we thought that it would be better to support the recommendations that are already in place, but we did come on board and we do want it to be successful. And so we are concerned, and I think we need to really see what the Commission is going to do in terms of response. You know, other areas of big concern, S3, their first piece of legislation was taken back to the drawing board in terms of inappropriate consultation. The minister, in terms of defining, you know, nation to nation and confusing messages around what free, prior, and informed consent means. So there's lots of great talk, and that's what we're hearing is great talk, but a lot of confusion, lack of clarity, and most importantly, we have to get this inquiry back on track.
Ms. Malcolmson, of course, the inquiry is something you've been interested in for quite some time. Do you agree with Ms. McLeod?
Canada needs the inquiry so badly to work really well, and the families have been waiting a long time. We lost a decade with the Conservatives, and there were extremely high hopes with the commitments that the Trudeau government made. On Friday in question period, I asked the minister, are you doing everything you can to ensure the success of the inquiry? She said 100% yes. Then Monday, these two reports come out, which echo very much what we've been hearing from the families. They're not being respected. They're not being communicated. How could Native Women's Association think there's upwards of 4,000 victims and have only less than 300 registered in the database? It's just a condemnation of bureaucracy as well as the good words not lining up with action. And we're particularly focused on what is it that the government can do. We're hearing quite a few groups saying that they're concerned that the government process is not allowing the money to flow to the inquiry commissioners, and that's what I've been asking in question period and in debates the last 3 days, and the government's not giving any ground on this at all. They won't even say that they're looking at the question of the process for approving funding. It's very disappointing.
Mr. Rusnick, of course, Minister Bennett has often said that the inquiry, their government is hands-off, they're arm's length from the inquiry. Is it time to change that and maybe expand the mandate, more time and more money for it?
Well, unlike, and I'm going to agree with Cathy McLeod here, unlike the previous government, our government started this inquiry and this process. They are truly independent. They've been having some issues, but at the heart of what the commissioners need to do is they need to focus on the families. And our government's been looking at the root causes of how this tragedy has continued, and looking at spending money on women's shelters and really solving the root causes of this problem. The commissioners, I know, hopefully get the commission moving and do their important work.
Ms. Malcolmson, how do you think the MMIW inquiry can get fixed or restarted?
We want to see the commissioners put the families at the center of the process. We want them to communicate well and respect them. We also want to keep pushing the government to say, are you doing everything you can to set up the commissioners for success? We keep hearing the minister say we have to keep at arm's length. We're not hearing anybody say that they're concerned about government interference in the inquiry. We're more concerned that the government is hobbling the inquiry by having vague terms of reference that don't directly say to everybody that policing and the role of policing is at the core of this. How the government could do their pre-inquiry consultations, spend all that time, but not at the same time be getting the office leases and helping with the staffing, or there's such a pent-up demand. People so believe that this is a good way forward, and I'm so worried on behalf of the whole country that people are going to lose faith in the ability of Canada to rectify the situation, and we won't be able to move forward.
I mean, one of the things that we heard that was particularly concerning is the sort of the intake process, where it's a very legal process and people have to tell their preliminary story, and then it gets decided, oh, is your story enough that we're going to actually hear you, or is it just going to get set into do a written submission? I mean, if you are a family member, I can't imagine a more difficult thing to be told that your story is not good enough to be heard. So I think, first of all, the Commission has to respond to each issue that was addressed both by the Native Women's Association and in the letter. That's number one. And although the Minister can say it's arm's length all they want, and the government can say that, but ultimately they are responsible. And so to make sure that it's successful, make sure the Secretariat that's supporting is doing everything it can, and if it's truly off the rails, they're going to have to intervene and make sure it moves forward in a way that puts families first.
Again, Mr. Resnick, do you feel that the inquiry is off the rails at this point?
I don't. The families need to be at the center, and that was clear in the terms of reference. As the minister said, that she expects the commissioners to have a clear work plan and to explain that work plan and to make sure that families are at the center.
I guess just to move or switch topics a little, Ms. MacLeod, the past two budgets have seen billions of dollars set aside for Indigenous people, more than even the Kelowna Accord. If we wait a few years, shouldn't things improve?
I think some of the money is filtering through, but there's also many stories we hear where dollars aren't filtering. So, for example, when I was home, I met with the people that deliver the child services, and they talked about how they haven't seen a penny more. So, there is a significant dollar commitment, and I will acknowledge the significant dollar commitment. Sometimes it's a bit of a razzle-dazzle because they talk, for example, water systems, where they're actually spending less on water systems than we did on an annual basis. But there's dollars. But what's going to be the test is at the end of the day, is it gotten sort of lost in sort of the systems, or is it making a difference in communities on the ground? So that's going to be the ultimate in 2 years, or in 2019. First Nations, as they look at those expenditures, is the money coming forward for education? Is our water system improved? Is our child and family services well organized in delivering effective services? That's going to be the true test.
Ms. Malcolmson, your thought? Of course, the Liberal government has spent a lot of money in the past two budgets.
They've announced a lot of money. They haven't honored the court ruling that Cindy Blackstock initiated around the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. She continues to say it's just $155 million that is needed to fund Indigenous kids at the same rate that the rest of Canadian children are around schooling and welfare. Is Canada so poor that it can't find $155 million to honor the repeated rulings of the Human Rights Tribunal? We also talk about domestic violence shelters. 5 shelters on reserve over 5 years is better than nothing, but my goodness, it's just a drop in the bucket. Palktutit, the Inuit women's organization, says 70% of Inuit women have no possibility of access to shelter. Even if there was space, it's just nowhere close to their community. So the need is so great, and that's the kind of infrastructure that I would love to see Canada delivering on immediately. We need to get some concrete results in order for people to have some hope that the lofty statements and the good promises are actually going to result in action people can see.
Mr. Rusnick. Well, I'll agree with Ms. Malcolmson that over many decades, the Indigenous file was neglected by previous governments of all stripes, and we've invested $11.8 billion over 6 years. A huge investment in the communities, but it's not only just about the money, it's about working in partnership with the communities and seeing what the communities want. This government's approach isn't going to be a top-down approach like other governments. We want to work in full partnership with Indigenous communities, making sure that they have the right things for their communities to lift them out of the despair and the great infrastructure need. We've seen 19 long-term drinking water advisories lifted. To go to Cindy Blackstock, 4,900 services funded for Indigenous youth under Jordan's principle. So things are happening. I know the NDP and the Conservatives are going to disagree with me, but we're working from the mantra that we work in full partnership with our Indigenous communities where no other government has done that in the past.
And briefly, I want to go back to Bill S3, which you mentioned, which is to get rid of sexual inequities in the Indian Act. I believe the deadline is fast approaching. Will the government meet that deadline?
Well, and I know the minister is working extremely hard, and it's a very important piece of legislation. We're fully committed to making sure there's equality within the systems that exist. But again, we feel that First Nations need to determine how things happen in their own communities, and we're working on there's a Law and Policies Review Committee of Cabinet that's looking at how everything in terms of the Indigenous file meshes with our Constitution. So there's a lot of important work happening behind the scenes, and we hope to have further news in the coming weeks and months.
So, of course, S3 is an example where they talk about working in partnership, where they didn't even talk to the complainant in terms of before this legislation was introduced. It was wrong. The Senate basically put them back to the drawing board because there wasn't appropriate working side by side with the First Nations communities. It does have to get done. I absolutely agree. We have a deadline. But, I mean, again, it's an example of we talk about working together, but when we actually introduce legislation to fix the issue, not only did we not properly consult, we didn't even talk to the person who won the court case. So that, to me, is not adequate consultation and working hand in hand.
And Ms. Malcolmson, you're new to the panel, so I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I'll say, speaking of working in cooperation and consultation, on the West Coast we heard solemn commitments around community consent and nation-to-nation relationship, completely obliterated by the government's approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline over the very strong objections of coastal First Nations, Sanemo and Seminas within my riding. And last summer I was up at Site C Dam with the chiefs of Prophet River and West Moberly, also saying we cannot believe that Trudeau approved Site C over our objections. What happened to the promises? So there's trust that was built, trust eroded very fast, and we need as a country to honor the commitments that this government has made so that we can move forward in a good way.
Okay, well, that's it. We're out of time. Thank you for doing this, and I hope you're all back next season when we do this again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a break. When we come back, Green Party leader Elizabeth May talks to us about the breakthrough of her party in the BC election and what it may mean for First Nations there. Welcome back. Green Party leader Elizabeth May has long been a severe critic of pipelines and the petroleum industry. But does this mean the interests of Indigenous people and environmentalists always line up? The British Columbia wing of the Green Party made some gains in last week's provincial election, potentially holding the balance of power there. She joins me in studio now. Welcome to the show, Ms. May.
Thank you, Todd. Great to be here.
Now, I went through the Green Party's list of its Aboriginal policy and saw a couple of items the Liberal government is doing already. For example, reviewing policies that affect Indigenous people. I guess, how would you rate how the Liberal government has done on the Indigenous file?
I have to say I'm surprised that they haven't done better. Certainly the 2016 budget was a good sign, given that that was $9 billion earmarked for various categories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis priorities. But the failure to respond, as we all know, the case that Cindy Blackstock and the case for First Nations children should not be discriminated against, and as long as the amount of money that government spends on basic needs of First Nations children is so much less than non-Indigenous children, there's a big question mark for me. Why is that still happening? Why hasn't that been addressed? I know that in the platform, the Liberals spoke about acknowledging and signing on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and yet there's some hesitation about fully signing on. So I'm not quite sure what that is about. So there are many places where I would like to see more, and where on a nation-to-nation basis, I was devastated. I have to say I mean, people in politics may say they're shocked, and maybe people don't really believe they were shocked. I was not only shocked, but devastated by the approvals for Site C permits last summer, by the approval for wood fiber LNG when Squamish First Nation is still dealing with whether they want it or not.
When it comes, sometimes environmental issues and what Indigenous leaders want are sometimes different. Sometimes they want economic development. For example, some chiefs in northern BC are opposed to Premier Christy Clark's proposal to ban tankers on the North Coast. I mean, how do you reconcile your party with some of those leaders?
What we have to do is, I mean, at the federal level, the Green Party is the only party that has officially, through our membership, renounced the doctrine of discovery. When we talk nation to nation, we want to find a way, and we need First Nations and Métis and Inuit leadership on this piece, obviously. But the Indian Act remains a colonial artifact that gets in the way of really understanding sovereign relationships nation to nation. So we really need to get to that. When we're dealing at a level of what the BC Green Party, by the way, and their platform, and talking about a shared stewardship and co-management. I mean, we have very good examples. If you look at, for instance, the co-management of the fisheries around Haida Gwaii, you have a really leading example. That's what we should be. We're not, as Greens, we're not against economic development. Neither are First Nations against economic development. But that development should be in the context of a sustainable, livable biosphere. You don't want to have economic development in the short term that means your kids have no future. So we need to work together, and we need to, when I say we, those of us who are part of a colonial heritage need to work in a very respectful way, and we'll be charting new territory. But if we're not implementing the recommendations of the Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in a way that suggests we're doing something differently from here on in, the next 150 years have to look very different from the previous 150 years. And that has to be on a very strong foundation of nation-to-nation relationship with respect and prior informed consent before development happens on First Nations territories.
So do you think that's something you may come to loggerheads over? It would be an issue like this. Of course, the Green Party, when it comes to tankers in the North Coast, no way you want to see that happen.
Neither does the Council of the Haida Nation. So we have to work these things through, as in any democracy, and the Greens are the only ones advocating for a Council of Canadian Governments with seats at the table for Métis, Inuit, and First Nations leadership, with federal representatives, provincial representatives, and municipal order of government around the same table, and say, what's the best solution here? Surely there's wisdom in that. So working together, I don't think there's any issue that we can't sort out. For instance, why would we want tankers loaded with bitumen and diluent, since we know bitumen and diluent is a mixture that can't be cleaned up? It's worse than the crude that spilled in Alaska for Exxon Valdez, because there is no technology to clean up bitumen mixed with diluent. And the position of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, at Squamish First Nations, close to the terminal for where Kinder Morgan wants to be increasing dramatically the number of Aframax tankers carrying this stuff offshore, those are legitimate concerns. So there may be conflict, but I think the kind of wisdom that comes clearly around what First Nations, what Indigenous title looks like, from the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Chilcotin is where we should look, which says First Nations title is title. I mean, it's I love the words of Beverly McLaughlin, the Chief Justice. Title is title is title. But it's also different in that fee simple title in a non-Indigenous property context is held by an individual. First Nations title is collective,
I just
and it's
wanted
also
but
intergenerational.
to talk about title,
Yeah.
we now have 3 Green Party MLAs.
Yeah.
We don't know yet for a couple of weeks whether they'll be the balance of power or not in the province, because right now it's a minority government. But if they are the balance of power, can those 3 individuals help push along issues like Aboriginal title, which is such an important issue in the province of BC?
I think so. I mean, especially considering that one of the 3 is Adam Olsen, who's now my MLA from where I live. I'm represented in the provincial legislature. Well, technically he's MLA-elect, but he's of Sartlip First Nation and has a tremendous depth of understanding. And I can't imagine a caucus of 3 MLAs where you basically 33% of the caucus is First Nations. It's not. I mean, I don't dictate, nor do I know what priorities the Green Caucus in the BC legislature will set for itself. But under the leadership of Andrew Weaver, with Sonia First now and Adam Olsen, I can't imagine that they wouldn't represent progress on a whole range of issues that I care about and that people who voted for them care about.
Okay, well, I wanted to go back to a question I wanted to ask earlier, and it's earlier this week. We heard about the proposed reforms to the National Energy Board. One of the recommendations is an expanded role for Indigenous people.
Right.
How does the Green Party view this recommendation?
Well, I think the recommendations of that panel are super. I mean, basically, it says the National Energy Board has lost the confidence of the public and of industry. This is a devastating critique of a regulatory body that has not inspired trust in anyone. So in rebuilding a different function, they would take it out of Calgary, because right now the National Energy Board Act requires that the National Energy Board be in Calgary and that all the board members of the NEB be resident in Calgary. They would move it, rename it to make it much clearer what its role is. Although the National Energy Board title suggests that it's actually looking at Canada's energy future or energy security or economy, it doesn't have any of those roles. So by renaming it the Canadian Energy Transmission Commission, it would be clearer that it's looking at pipelines and transmission lines for electricity. Basing it in Ottawa will clarify, again, a more specific and narrow role that this body plays, and to have it advised by, I think they describe it as a council of elders, to ensure that what the newly named Commission for Energy Transmission Commission does is actually respectful and on an early stage, at an early stage of development of any project, is doing legitimate consultation with First Nations communities as well as Métis communities and Inuit communities if there's transmission lines that affect Inuit territory.
Okay, on that note, run all out of time. Thank you for coming in and doing this.
Thank you.
Next week, Jorge Barrera will be here for the season finale of Nation to Nation. He'll be talking to 3 journalists who've covered protests. They'll discuss how close is too close and how to stay safe during these encounters. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.